Hello everyone, we are Group 10. Today we will discuss business cycle analyzing economy fluctuations. There is a scenario in this topic. Country B such as Japan or United States face economic recessions with falling GDP, rising unemployment, and low consumer confidence. To address the recessions, central banks suggest to lower interest rate, while governments suggest to implement fiscal stimulus focused on infrastructure spending. The first question is using Keynesian's business cycle theory to explain the impact of a fiscal stimulus on aggregate demand, GDP, and unemployment. According to Keynesian's theory, economic fluctuations are driven by aggregate demand. In this theory, there are various assumptions such as prices and wages are sticky, aggregate demand determine output and employment, money is non-neutral, and government intervention is necessary. Basically, fiscal stimulus include increased government spending and tax cut. However, in this scenario, we focus on spending, as mentioned earlier.
About ISLM curve first, and at the beginning the economy is in equilibrium at point y1 and interest rate at r1. So when the government implement a fiscal stimulus, for this case is increase the infrastructure spendings, and this means that the government spending, which is G, will increases, and this spending will increase the aggregate demand, which will shift the IS curve from to the right from IS1 to IS2, and as a result, output in the economy will rises from Y1 to Y2, and because more income is being earned, people want to hold more money, but since the money supply is fixed, this will pushes the interest rate up from R1 to R2, and over time, this higher demand in the economy will causes the price to increase, so the price level rises. This will reduce the real money supply, which what we call M over P, and that leads to a leftward shift of the LM curve from LM1 to LM2, and eventually a new equilibrium is reached at Y2 and the higher interest rate at R2. Moving on is the ADAS curve. So as what I mentioned just now, the increase of the government spending, for this case is the infrastructure spending, will increase the aggregate demand. When the aggregate demand increases, means that it will shift to the right from AD1 to AD2. So when AD1 curve intersect with AS curve, this will lead to a higher output at Y1 and higher price at P2. So for this diagram, what I can conclude is that fiscal stimulus, it can increase the real output or GDP, but it also can causes the inflationary pressure in the short run because of the increase of the price.
For labor market, the initial equilibrium is at M1 with the market real wage W per P1. At this moment, the unemployment occurs since the labor demand is less than the labor supply. When price increase from P1 to P2, interest rate will also increase from R1 to R2. This leads to the real wage fall to W per P2. The increase in interest rate will cause the labor supply to shift to the right from NSR1 to NSR2. If the government spending increased by the right amount, the new equilibrium will achieve at N2, thus the unemployment will reduce. For production function, as the output increase from Y1 to Y2, employment increase from M1 to N2, a higher GDP growth will lead to lower unemployment. In summary, when government implement a fiscal stimulus, especially increase in infrastructure spending to cope with the economic recession, it can help to increase in aggregate demand and GDP while lower the unemployment.
Good day everyone, my name is Henry, and now we'll proceed with the question number 2. Compare the likely effects of monetary policy through lowering interest rate versus fiscal policy through infrastructure spending in stimulating economic recovery. First, we look at the likely effect of monetary policy, which is through lower interest rate in stimulating economic recovery. By looking at the graph, we can say the economic recession exists. This can be seen in graph C. The unemployment gap is big because the labor supply, which is the NS, is more than labor demand, ND. To overcome this, the central bank can lower the interest rate. This will make the borrowing become more cheaper, hence there will be more money supply in the economy. When MS increased just by the right amount, LM will shift to right from LM1 to LM2. In diagram B, since people have more money to purchase goods, hence aggregate demand will shift to right from AD1 to AD2. This will result in increase in price to P2 and the real output will also increase to Y2. When price increase, the real money supply, which is M divided by P, will decrease, which means less liquidity in the economy. Result in LM shift to the left to LM3, but it does not completely offset the rightward shift in LM. This will result in decrease in real interest rate R1 to R2, and this can be seen in diagram A. When real interest rate decrease, this means that labor will become less interested to work because the future reward from saving rate is lower. Hence, labor supply will shift to the left from NSR1 to NSR2. This will cause the real wage to reduce to W divided by P2. If the increase in the money supply is just right, the full employment is achieved with the quantity of employment being in N2. It is shown in the diagram C. Hence, the final result is interest rate decrease, real output increase, real wage decrease, and employment increase.
Now we're going to look at the likely effects of fiscal policy in stimulating the economic recovery. In this case, it is infrastructure spending. So, in diagram C, the employment is initially at N1, which is less the quantity of labor that is supplied at real wage WP1. When the government spends on infrastructure, it will create aggregate demand as construction of the infrastructure will create jobs and income that will increase the purchasing power of the workers, which also the consumers. This is reflected in diagram B, where the AD curve shifts to the right to AD2, and this increases the equilibrium of output produced to meet that demand from Y1 to Y2, and the price increase from P1 to P2. In diagram A, IS curve will shift to the right to IS2 as a new equilibrium shift, and the interest rate R will increase from R1 to R2. And over time, the increased demand will encourage spending that reduces the money supply. This shifts the LM curve to the left to LM2 in diagram A. The central bank may also reduce or hold constant the money supply in order to prevent inflation. In diagram C, real wage will decrease to WP2 as the price level increase. This, with the increasing R, the labor supply would shift to the right to NSR2, and the new equilibrium of employment will shift to the right from N1 to N2.
Next, we'll compare between monetary and fiscal policy. We'll first look at the similarities. So the first is lower real wage. Lower real wage encourages firms to hire more workers due to reduction in the labor costs. It also improves their competitiveness because lower wage means lower cost of production. Therefore, exports become cheaper and more attractive to foreign markets. The next effect is higher employment. Higher employment means more people have jobs and disposable income to spend. Higher employment also means there is increased consumer confidence. Consumers will feel more secure in their economic situation, leading to higher spending and saving. As a result, higher employment directly contributes to increased aggregate demand and GDP growth. The third effect is increased real output. This suggests that business are responding to increased demand. It can also lead to higher incomes and more job opportunities. As the real output increases, it directly raises GDP, helping to reverse the recession effect. Now we will look at the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. The first difference is in terms of R, which is the interest rate. So for monetary policy, there will be a small decrease in R, while for fiscal policy, there will be a large increase in R. The small decrease in R for monetary policy will be accompanied by smaller shift in the labor supply curve, which is the NS curve. And for fiscal policy, the large increase in R will be accompanied by larger shift in the NS curve. The third difference is in terms of real wage. We can see that for monetary policy, there's a small decrease in real wage, while fiscal policy will have a large decrease in real wage. We can also compare in terms of employment level. For monetary policy, there's a small increase in the employment level, while fiscal policy will have large increase in the employment level.
Now, the example of country that we can use as a country B is United States during the Great Recession. It happens on 2007, whereby the US housing market went from boom to bust, and the large amount of mortgage-backed securities (MBS) and derivative plumb in value. This resulted in GDP fell by 4.3%, unemployment rate increases until it reached 9.5%, and the consumer confidence index also decreased to 96.59, and it is considering pessimism. During that time, US implemented expansionary monetary policy by reducing the federal fund rate to around 0 to 0.25% in December 2008. The result shows that there is no immediate effect on the unemployment rate, but after 2009, the unemployment rate decreases until it reached 5%. For GDP output, it also slowly improved, in which it grew at annual rate 1.3% in mid-2011. For real wages, it shows the decrease from 96.66 in Q4 2008 to 96.32 in Q4 2009. While for consumer confidence index, it shows the improvement, but perhaps not due to the monetary policy. Instead, it is due to the American Recovery Reinvestment Act (ARA) of 2009, where the government pumped money to the economy by $787 billion.
The COVID-19 pandemic had triggered a global lockdown and deepest economic recession since the World War II. In the EU itself, the GDP had dropped to 6.4% and in the Eurozone is 6.8%. The unemployment had reached up to 7.6% and the government deficit increased to 7.2% of GDP. Public debt also rose sharply to 98% in 2020. In response, the EU had implemented the Next Generation EU, which is a fiscal policy that contains a part of infrastructure development. And because of that, youth and long-term unemployment also improved and returned back to pre-pandemic level by 2022, and because of the job creation in the green and digital sectors. EU GDP has also rebounded strongly in 2021 and 2022, which is 5.4% and 3.5% respectively.
For question 3, propose a balanced policy response that combines both fiscal and monetary tools. Justify your recommendation based on macroeconomic theory and the current state of economy. For this question, May and Sharon will explain it. To address these challenges, we propose a combination of fiscal and monetary policy tools. First, fiscal policy. The government should implement expansionary fiscal measures, particularly through public investment projects such as buildings, transportation infrastructure like roads and railways. Second, expanding digital connectivity and green energy projects. This initiative directly create employment, boost incomes, and stimulate demand throughout the economy. According to Keynesian economic theory, when private sector demand is weak, as it is during a recession, government spending can play a critical role in jump-starting the economy. Through the multiplier effect, one round of spending leads to a further increases in income and consumption, resulting in a large overall increase in GDP. Second, monetary policy. To complement fiscal effort, the central bank should adopt an expansionary monetary policy by increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates. Based on the ISLM model, lower interest rates will first encourage households and businesses to borrow and invest. Second, reduce the cost of financing large purchases and capital projects. Third, stimulate both private and consumption. However, in a low confidence environment, monetary policy alone may not be enough. That's why using it alongside fiscal stimulus creates a more powerful, coordinated impact. For expected outcomes, by applying both policies simultaneously, we can achieve several macroeconomic goals. First, boost economic GDP through combined government and private sector spending. Second, reduce unemployment by creating new jobs across sectors. Third, strengthen investment and consumption by restoring confidence and improve access to credit. Lastly, avoid a prolonged downturn and set the economy on a path to recovery.
For country B, we have suggested a balanced policy which include both fiscal and also monetary policy. For fiscal policy, country B can implement an expansionary fiscal policy which will then increase their aggregate demand and their level of GDP. This will then shift the IS curve to the right from IS0 to IS1, which will then cause an increase in the GDP level from Y0 to Y1. However, this will also increase the interest rate from R0 to R1, which will then prevent investments and also borrowing among households. Therefore, in order to compensate with this problem, country B can also implement an expansionary monetary policy by increasing the money circulations in the market. This will later on shift the LM curve to the right from LM0 to LM1, which will then reduce back the interest rate to the initial level, which is R0. Through this, country B can increase their level of output and GDP without really sacrificing their interest rate. For real life example, we can look at the United Kingdom in 2020 during the pandemic of COVID-19. where they had faced a similar situation with country B by having a decline in GDP level and also increase in an unemployment rate. To tackle this issue, the government of United Kingdom has imposed an expansionary fiscal policy by paying 80% of the wages of labourers that could not work due to MCO and also improve their overall healthcare infrastructures. While for monetary policy, the Bank of England has imposed an expansionary monetary policy by reducing the interest rate with the hope to stimulate investment and also encourage borrowing among the households. These are the references that we had used. Thank you for listening.